Welcome everyone to Warrior Diplomacy and this episode on illicit financial flows. And this would be
This would be Elon Musk's favorite podcast. Christian
all
Armis.
right.
I don't know if you read the news, but he bought Twitter, and there's this tweet laying around in the social support diplomacy. It says he wants to buy the podcast as well. I don't know, might be fake news, but who knows? The guy is crazy, so maybe. How are you guys?
I just signed my job offer for going to Georgia starting from September, and I work there for the Institute for the Study of Nationalism and Conflict, and I'm really looking forward to that. And hopefully, Vladimir Putin won't cross my plans.
That's very
Good, man.
exciting. Like,
Great news.
congratulations. That's going to be a great adventure.
Thanks.
Absolutely. And you, Chris, how's it been so far? How's the essays going? You went to Oslo, right?
Yeah, so I was back home for a couple of weeks now, and got to do some writing. Back here in Brussels now to do more of it, and looking forward to finishing up and then having some time off before next semester, I think. And you, Fabio?
No, I'm all good. I'm all good. I was in Spain for a little while. We did a gathering with the listeners of the episode in Spanish. So it was really nice to get to know the faces and the people that listen to the podcast, at least in Spanish. Hopefully, we can do a similar activity in Brussels or in Vienna, somewhere in Europe after the summer or during the summer. That'd be nice once we have more listeners in English. So looking forward for that as well. And really looking forward for this episode. I think it's an
Yeah,
interesting
it's going to be
topic. We
great.
have a great guest. So looking forward for that.
I actually got, while being back in Norway for a couple of weeks, I got to meet our great guest today, Daniel Jimenez. Can you say hi? How are you?
Hi, thank you guys for inviting me. I'm good. I'm good, yes, and I'm looking forward to this podcast. It's a very interesting, very relevant topic. Yeah, even more so in these days. So looking forward to talk to you about it.
That's great. So Daniel works at the Norwegian Foreign Ministry in the section for development and strategic partnerships. And he's been in the ministry for some years now, a career spanning postings in both Afghanistan and Chile, and then most recently at the Norwegian mission to the UN in New York, where after being posted there for a couple of years, he was seconded to the President of the General Assembly of the United Nations office, working specifically with illicit financial flows, and then being one of the main drivers for the work of the FACT panel, which is the high-level panel of financial accountability, transparency, and integrity, which is a very interesting project that has been going on in the UN for the last couple of years now. Me and Daniel have known each other for a very long time and also had the pleasure of working together on topics related to illicit financial flows when he was at the UN and I was at the Norwegian mission to the UN as a trainee there a couple of years back. So we have some common ground on these issues, but I think it might be a good way to start off this episode is talking about illicit financial flows, because it is not yet like a very firm agreement on the conceptual and definitional issues related to the term. And even though there are being made substantial work on it from both the UN system, the World Bank, the IMF, OECD, and a lot of civil society organizations, there is still like an inability to reach political consensus among states, which leaves the international community kind of without a proper definition and some problems with tackling the issue there. We can talk about it as the illegal movement of money from or capital from one country to another, but it's vast network of different concepts that happen at the same time. And with the rapid advance of globalization and the ease that individuals can have and corporation can have in transactions across borders, it has made the problem a lot bigger. But I think we could start off with a definition from you, Daniel, because I'm thinking with illicit financial flows, it's also one of those terms that for a lot of people have certain connotations. It can be tax haven, terrorism, or drug financing, but a lot of it is actually happening in very mundane circumstances in daily operations of many sectors of society, what has been termed enablers. So could you give an example of some illicit financial flows, and then maybe also talk about these small circumstances where it happens?
I think, yeah, it's probably good to start on the issue of definition, because it's true that what's been lacking is a universally agreed definition as to what exactly constitutes illicit financial flows. And that's also what's made it difficult to discuss the topic in multilateral agreements and negotiations with a view to effectively combat them and curb them. So I think it would be more accurate to say actually that there are several definitions, you have the legal interpretations of it, which based on a lot of empirical literature that says that illicit financial flows is predominantly built referring to money that is earned, transferred, or used in contravention to existing law. And in some cases, that means that money that is earned legally is transferred out of countries illegally to evade taxes and or currency controls, etc. So there's many different sources of that. Like you can have drug trafficking, you can have embezzlement, money laundering, of course. And illicit financial flows is basically classified based on whether actors are involved in international crime, criminal organizations. It can be individuals, corporations as well. Whichever definition you use, the estimates of the size of the money is substantial, although it is also controversial because there is sort of a consensus among development scholars and practitioners is that the outflows, on average, they exceed official development assistance going into developing countries. So that is a main issue that we sort of try to tackle when we talk about this. And it's worth dwelling on that for just a moment, because the main issue here is the world has agreed on very ambitious plans for financing and implementing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And what we see is that illicit financial flows are a major leak. They constitute a major leak, especially from developing countries, but also from Western countries and in the developed world. So regardless of which definition you use, we're talking about sums that are astronomical. We're talking, according to the World Bank, the Global Financial Integrity, we're talking about somewhere between 600 billion to a trillion. According to UNCTAD, in Africa alone, it's something around 90 billion that is lost revenue, which is about 4 or 5% of GDP from Africa. And it spans a whole series of different sectors. So you have trade misinvoicing, creative bookkeeping in that sector. You have tax abuse, of course. You have cross-border corruption, and altogether they completely drain resources from sustainable development. And of course, more than that, you also have the inequalities that it foments. So you have instability that is fueled because of this. It undermines governance. It completely undermines trust towards democratic institutions. And in the end, that's the big problem as well. Democracy, it erodes trust in democracy in the end. So it is really something that needs to be tackled. I think we need to get this right in order to reach the Sustainable Development Goals.
One of the major issues of today is finding common ground on how and where do we tackle this. You have some experience, Fabio, from working at the OECD. Did you have any insight into what any of the work there was being made with the OECD, and how this aligns with what Daniel has been talking about here?
Yeah, well, Chris, basically when I was working when I was doing my internship in the OECD, I was in the tax department, and I was in this session that we were doing like these capacity building sessions with tax officials of different developing countries. And what the OECD would do is like they would go to the different multilateral tax locations around the world. There was one in Europe, one in America, one in Asia, and OECD tax officials would go and try to explain what's the best practices that the OECD tries to implement. The policy behind this action was to try to train these tax officials and how to help them avoid that the companies there avoid taxes or pay what they should, right? So that was basically the whole project. The technical aspect of it, I wish I knew a little bit more about it. But that was basically what I was doing there. Another couple projects from the OECD to fight tax and international tax avoidance is the BEPS system, the Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Program, which attempts to reform international tax rules and ensure that multinationals pay their fair part. There are other programs as well, like the Tax Inspectors Without Borders and capacity building in developing countries. All of this in the pursuit of a better tax regulatory framework internationally. And I wanted to ask our guest, because that was like the OECD part, but how does the UN tackle or try to tackle tax evasion and illicit financial flows? Like, what are the main mechanisms?
I mean, there in the United Nations, you have several different entities that deal with the question of tax evasion and taxes in general. You have, of course, the UN Tax Committee, which has members from across the world, and it's been growing the last year. So it has been becoming a more relevant body. But the developing countries are very interested in upgrading this to become a intergovernmental body on taxes, which with more authority and even more universal, and where you create not just normative principles, but actually principles and standards that will be followed up and enforced. And I think that because the thing is, you do have in the UN as well some binding conventions that exist today that deal with these issues, and that is specifically the United Nations Convention on Corruption, the UNCAC, and then you have a United Nations Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, which is also called the UNTOC, and those are based in Vienna, right? Those are under the auspices of the UNODC, Organization of Drugs and Crime, and those are binding. So that those deal with the criminal aspects of illicit financial flows, and there's pretty much general consensus in the United Nations that those are that's like agreed language, accepted issues to talk about, and very much a lot of countries are stressing that you need to implement those paragraphs and those principles that are in those conventions, right? Problem with those conventions, I think, is that there's no real enforcement mechanism that push those principles through that countries have to abide by. I mean, you have the Financial Action Task Force, which is backed by US kind of sanctions, actually, or gray listing, as they call it, where they put countries under review if they don't implement these principles. But the problem with FATF, the task force, is that it's not universal. Of course, there are some countries that are members and others that are not, and so this is a problem in the view of developing countries, because many countries are feeling that they are unrightfully subjected to standards while not having a real influence in creating those standards. And so but when it comes to the issue of taxes, dealing with the commercial aspects very often of illicit financial flows, there is no convention. So that while you have conventions for those criminal aspects of illicit financial flows, you don't really for taxes, and that is where we run into problems, because you have the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which basically says that development finance now is a lot more than just north-south assistance, and it includes public-private partnerships and regional development banks and all these things. You basically need to harness the resources that come from proper taxation. And today, the current tax system is based on a really complex network of like 3,000 bilateral tax agreements between countries, and there is no real overarching body that looks at the coherence of all of that. And so that's how you get the problem of tax evasion, because it's really goes into what is legal and what is illegal, and those gray areas of how businesses are operating and how trade is conducted. The metaphor for us often is that bathtub, you're trying to fill a bathtub, but it's constantly leaking in the other end. And that is the case of illicit financial flows.
So why do those loopholes exist? Are there any major world powers who really profit from tax evasion and related issues, who are actively preventing those loopholes from being closed, or to what can you pin it down?
Yeah, I think that's, of course, a big part of it. One of the first part, I guess, is sovereignty when it comes to finance. A lot of countries, they would insist, and rightfully so, to have a autonomy when it comes to finance, to decide themselves their own financial, setting interest rates, of course, national issues around that, and of course tax as well is a tool for countries to regulate their own economy. And so they don't want to leave that type of decision making to multilateral bodies. And then the other one is, of course, that there are some very powerful vested interests through multinational companies and digital massive tech giants that are standing in the way of changing a system which is very favorable to the way that they operate, because they are in effect able to operate in certain countries and to have very profitable operations and not pay taxes according to their global profits, but a very small part goes to taxes there, and so that is, you have those interests there, and they are very clearly defended and very clearly protected by states that don't want to see any changes in the current way that tax is dealt with multilaterally.
And I think that we come to that conception that we listen a lot, that it's tax haven, right? But I think that there is not an actual definition of that. But tax haven is a country that offers foreign businesses and individuals minimal or no tax liability for their bank deposits in a politically and economically stable environment. So this has a lot of tax advantages for corporations in their pursuit of trying to avoid or pay as least tax as possible. We find tax havens all over the world. Some of the most famous cases are, of course, the Cayman Islands and many other countries in the Caribbean, but there's also some countries that could be considered tax havens in Europe as well. So I was talking with Armis a little bit about this today, I think, and he told me that there's some countries, even here in Europe, that they could be considered a tax haven, like Ireland, that they have really low tax legislation, so companies profit from that. I don't know.
Yeah.
How can you consider what's a tax haven and what's not a tax haven?
It's like you say, it's true that you have tax havens come in many different shapes and forms. There are tax havens in developing countries, and there's tax havens definitely in developed countries. I think historically, I mean, in the 70s, 80s, there was this push for a lot of small island states specifically to focus their operations around financial systems that were closed and more sort of opaque, that were not transparent, basically, because they would attract a lot of investments, and that was it was encouraged to provide these kinds of safe havens, in a way, if you will, financially. And now I think the world has sort of changed their narrative around acceptance of that, and so a lot of these countries are now being told that's a no-go, that's ethically unjustifiable or indefensible. And so that there's been a change there, and also in some European countries, for sure. I mean, you have the Channel Islands of the UK, you have proper UK, other islands of the UK as well, and you have, of course, Ireland, which with a very low rate of taxation, and you have your Luxembourg, of course, which was very clearly shown through the Luxembourg leaks. A lot of systems that were exposed in the Panama Papers. You have, in terms of the Caribbean, the complex network of shell companies there that are just basically post boxes for different companies. You have some islands where you have 3,000, 4,000 companies, but only 1,000, 1,500 people. It's been very sophisticated, the way that it's been set up, and it works because there are these loopholes, right? And it's not illegal.
So we're basically dealing with something that can be understood as kind of like a consequence of having a capitalist system run wild, with corporations basically dictating a lot of the rules that most states also have to abide by in the international arena. Where do we see the work being done now? Which direction is it going in? Are we approaching the founding of a new system for dealing with this, or are we still kind of at the stalemate?
I mean, there's been the last 5-10 years, I guess, there's been a movement towards more action in this area, very much led by a very active civil society movement, but also the different leaks that I mentioned have sort of ushered this call to action. And you have some very brave journalists and some very large networks of journalists, like the ICIJ, the International Journalist Consortium, that basically has been exposing all of these hidden ways that money is being funneled around the international system. And I think that has created more activism and less tolerance for these types of practices, harmful tax practices. And so that's like one side. And the other side is, of course, the whole the move on terrorism, against terrorism, and against money laundering and against international organized crime, which you have, a lot of good work is taking place in the OECD, in the conventions that exist, and also in the different organizations that are fighting international and transnational organized crime. So like when I started in the UN in 2015, there wasn't that many references to this. I mean, it came, of course, in under the Addis financing for development framework, but now I see that it's a major theme in the discussions, illicit financial flows, but it continues to be very difficult and very controversial.
Yeah, I wanted to touch into another topic. Yet we talked a lot about how state and private sectors are exploiting illicit financial flows and profiting from it. But what actually about the criminal activities? Are they facing more pressure in these decades through newly established mechanisms, or are they able to exploit new digital means? If we look at a cartel being based in Colombia back in the 70s, was it easier for them to distribute the illicit financial flows, or is it really now today a different process and very much harder for them?
That's a good question. It's not my expertise exactly, but I think it goes both ways, because I mean, in the past, when there wasn't this elaborate, digitized economy, and the whole, where it was more difficult to operate, online or through these, the crypto transaction networks that we have now. I think it probably was easy to some extent to circumvent different, regulations. But it's also, those same networks that you have now, they're kind of facilitating like a hidden shadow network. People with criminal intentions of moving contraband and other things, they will always find a way to circumvent, the legal mechanisms that there are. But definitely, I think this sophisticated network of illicit financial flows has made it easy, and they know how to operate in those loopholes, but so the loopholes are there for criminal activity, but and also for the legitimate companies to exploit, to hide away money.
And now I think we're kind of moving into a very interesting and highly relevant topic in relation to this, because I want to ask you a bit later, Daniel, on how this ties into the work that you've been doing and what we're seeing with the FACTI panel on some of these issues. But I thought we could maybe go a bit further into how these new technologies facilitate illicit financial flows. I'm kind of thinking of how cryptocurrencies have increased availability for tax evasion, also for financing of criminal activity, as you were touching upon, Aramis. And also you have this, the old school way of stashing money into, or assets into, like expensive art, and now you have these NFTs, right? That people are going crazy about. Like that's the new cool thing for the kids on the block. It's the buying digital art with cryptocurrencies. You have some of these that are going for millions. Like they're setting records by the week. It has no function, so certainly there must be like a component of people like having either like a very big necessity of showing their wealth, and giving themselves an ego boost, but also like with high art in the old school way of stashing assets away, it must be a component there that goes into hiding your money into different channels. I thought that I wanted to ask you a bit about this, Fabio. You have some insights into both the dealings of different organizations on digital.
It's not my topic of expertise, but I
All
find
right.
it really interesting that now that the economy is transitioning into more like virtual methods, what Daniel was saying, right? Like how companies have always found ways to maybe go around and circumvent the limitations, but now maybe you leave a virtual footprint, and now it could be a little bit easier to follow the money, right? And a Mexican candidate for the presidency some years ago, he was presenting this idea that maybe all of the transactions that the government makes, at least paying the delegates and whatever, they should be like tracked by a blockchain. So it could be easy for the administration to know when money is being diverted into corruption cases and stuff, right? And I found it to be a really interesting proposal. Of course, like we're talking about a developing country such as Mexico, with its administration really limited. So how could that be implemented? That's a topic for another episode. But I mean, the idea itself, I think it's really interesting. And I feel like now with like we should make the most out of technology progress, right? And if we can implement some of those devices and methods to better administrate and fight against tax evasion, we should do it. The same, like I wish I knew more about the topic, and I wish I knew more about how this is actually being taken forward. But I am sure that many administrations around the world and international organizations such as the UN and the OECD, they're getting there. And usually with technological progress, it goes way faster than the administrations can follow, right? So it's that race. It's a little bit of a competition, right? So technology goes forward, and then all the administration has to follow. But I feel, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the world is trying to push in that agenda and implement policies regarding that digitalization of economy and these things.
A lot of countries are racing to try to see how they can regulate cryptocurrency and these digital transactions, but they're struggling to do so because of course the whole the way that they were created, it's basically the free coding makes it very difficult. But yeah, for sure, in illicit activity and illicit transactions, I think cryptocurrencies and that whole aspect of it is very interesting because you can launder, of course, criminal proceeds easy. A lot of transactions that may not have been cryptocurrency from the beginning, they can be used for illicit transactions down the line. So on the dark web, you have the purchase and sale of illicit drugs, debit and credit card information, at ransom as well. So we've seen all these things happen, and that's sort of the opponents of crypto will use all of these activities to try to justify some regulation on it. But then there are other aspects that are not always necessarily negative. So you have a very difficult picture there where states are trying to come up with good solutions.
And we have countries such as El Salvador that put Bitcoin as a legal tender for the economy, right? So countries are, I don't even know how to approach cryptocurrency, like from a state perspective. Like what I wish I understood like the economic aspect of what implementing Bitcoin as a legal tender for your country does to the economy. I think that we'll see in the coming months, years, how that affects El Salvador's economy. But I just find it fascinating how the whole world is changing in these ways. And do we even understand it? To a certain extent, I don't know if we do, but it's here and it's here to stay. So
yeah,
definitely.
Unless it crashes, like some people are saying.
Yeah,
maybe.
So,
maybe it's a bubble. And what would happen if a big crypto pops? Imagine the amount of money there
already, but it usually carries itself up again. So it's like hard to tell if it will ever reach the point where it crashes completely. But we know that it has downfalls that are very significant for the whole currency. But it seems to be, even though it's very volatile, it seems to be also receptive to recover from these crashes.
I don't know why, but I just feel like Christian invests in Bitcoin. You gave me the impression you have money there involved.
I'm the biggest crypto opponent. My crypto friends hate me because every time we talk, I will go on a rant with them about the bad aspects of crypto. But I try to be nuanced in this conversation and not sound like I'm as big of an opponent as I am.
One last aspect I wanted to touch upon is cryptocurrencies are becoming, of course, more and more important. And I think at some point they will become too big to fail. Maybe at some point governments will have to actually save cryptocurrencies, because if they crash, there might be another financial crisis coming in. So yeah, ironically, maybe states one day might have to save it, even though right now they might want to crack it down. So yeah, that's just another interesting aspect.
Yeah, and it's also it's a very emotional currency right now. That's I mean, basically, you can be a millionaire on Wednesday and you can be broke on Thursday, depending on what 10,000 people feel about the currency. So I think it doesn't have the solid backing of any institution to give it that security. But money in general is based on people's emotions and trusts. But I think it's a little bit more volatile in the world of crypto. So
when it's based out of like an uncentralized or decentralized source, that also kind of incentivizes it to be more or less like you see everyone acting around crypto, that it's the ones who are investing have to kind of convince everyone else that it's such a good idea to invest, because if no one else invests, then their investments are not going anywhere. A bit back to our general topic here, I wanted to touch on the faculty panel, Daniel, because that has been kind of one of your main projects for the last years. You were in the early stages of developing this project, which is a high level panel at the UN on financial accountability, transparency, and integrity. I thought it would be interesting to get some insight into both the lead up in the process of creating this, and also how establishing the whole panel was.
Yeah, no, as you know, Christian, I mean, you were there, we were there together in New York, and when this came about, and basically the FACTI panel, which has this definition, well, what it means is it's a panel on accountability, transparency, and integrity. So those are kind of normative big terms that different countries might put different things into, but it basically goes to the core of fighting harmful practices in the world of finance, and specifically tax corruption, and also another big one in the UN, which is the assets recovery, which is basically some developing countries that are requesting a more effective implementation of getting stolen assets back, right? And so when the FACTI panel, when the idea came about, it came out of the context of what we've been talking about, of this big problem of the international community to effectively deal with illicit financial flows. And so we saw that there is a need for a more consciousness and more action because of the detrimental effect that illicit financial flows and lack of transparency in the financial sector has, specifically towards the implementation of UN commonly agreed goals. So what we did was we appointed 17 panelists. So the presidency of the General Assembly, for whom I worked, he was Nigerian at the time, and the president of the ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Committee in the UN, who was Norwegian at the time. Together, they were like the co-hosts for this panel. They led this panel, and then we were working behind the scenes to basically set this up. So the 17 panelists that we found, they came from the whole. They were like geographically represented from every region. That's important when you create a high-level UN panel, that you have representation from across the regional groups in the UN. But also they came from the world of policymakers. They were advocates, NGO representatives. They were researchers, and also business leaders. And the point there is that you need to have a cross-sectorial perspective on this issue, because it goes into so many different areas, right? It really is it transcends the world of finance. It goes into the social sectors, and it goes into the world of business, and et cetera, et cetera. So basically, what you wanted to do now was to look at the shortcomings, the gaps in the current financial architecture and the system of economic governance that permits systematic tax evasion and corruption to continue. I think the main takeaways is that in order to meet our development goals, you need to basically stem these illicit financial flows. And especially in the tax area, the factor report shows that the current system is just so fragmented and it's not inclusive enough. And so the recommendations, they emphasize the need to make it more inclusive, and to do that, they talk about giving the UN a stronger role, like you have in the UN Statistical Commission, for example.
I also remember like one of the recommendations that was mainly targeted towards like the business sector is talking more of like the need for a cultural shift, among people in different sectors that inherit this term of enablers, which kind of facilitate different aspects of illicit financial flows. I think it's interesting to kind of think how to approach that cultural shift, because with the financial culture that we have today, and we've kind of been talking about it, how realistic is it, and how should it be approached? I'm thinking about asking some of you guys, like Fabio, Aramis, your thoughts on business. Should business lead the way, or governments lead the way in kind of setting rules, or changing the culture of how operations are conducted?
I think both are kind of unqualified to do that job, because both exploit illicit financial flows and profit from it. But at some point, that's just the flaws of the international order. We are not governed by some experts only making perfect decisions. At some point, we just have to find our way and find a certain interplay there where just the best solutions are worked out. And I think that there's a big potential within the UN. But we talked a lot about the UN today, but I think another potential are Western countries. Western countries are leading global economics, and they can exercise a lot of pressure to other tax havens through sanctions and other economic means. And so I think the West really does have a responsibility to crack down this issue and to improve the situation. But the West cannot enforce this if they will not begin to crack down their own problems regarding this issue. I know there has been a lot of improvement in the last decades, for example, when I think of Switzerland, when I think of the EU. But to this day, there are a lot of issues. And I think a first step is that the West does a lot of reforms for themselves, so they're actually credible in this issue. Then the next step, aside from the efforts from the UN, I think it is the responsibility of the developed economies of the West to exercise pressure in this regard and to enforce solutions.
And like maybe to complement, sorry, then just to complement a bit what Armi said, I agree. I think that it has to be mostly like a wholesome approach, right? Like maybe states should lead the way because they're the ones most interested that these illicit financial flows are cut. But there has to be some feedback from civil society, from the business themselves. And of course, that it has to be globally implemented. And it's true that maybe the one that's pushing hardest is the OECD, which is basically the most developed economies in the world. But it's not enough. It has to be a worldwide approach. And I think that that's where the UN might be the platform to do so. I understand that there's a lot of political problems and obstacles along the way, but I think that's the way to go. I feel like the OECD kind of led the way with trying to tax digital companies. And then in the G20 last year, or the one before, it got accepted, right, with that framework. So I think it has to be a wholesome approach that goes through stages until you can take it like to a global framework.
No, I think you're right. I think the European and the Western countries definitely have an important role to play here. I mean, now with the digital taxation, it's interesting as well, because European countries are finding themselves in a position of losing, because they are source countries for these big tech companies as well, right? So that is something that is putting an interesting new dynamic into those discussions. And I think it's very positive that the US with Biden has been more forward leaning when it comes to taxation of multinational companies. And they proposed, as part of the Building Back Better plan of Biden, proposed a pretty, dramatic new set of suggestions for basically taxing multinational companies back to U.S. taxes to provide more income. And I think it's like the biggest tax overhaul proposed since the Reagan administration, right? And of course, Biden is struggling to get this through because they've been blocking his plan for Building Back Better. So it's really critical that the U.S. keeps fighting this fight, because and the EU also sees that it's in their interest to get an agreement on digital taxation, which is fair, because they also stand to lose a lot. And so if you start to see how you lose on your own turf, both politically and economically, then I think there's a momentum there to create those changes. And for developing countries, I think they're already more than ready for the OECD to come with for the international multilateral system to make some stronger commitments in terms of taxation of multinationals. It's just that you need the big, powerful countries to see the light. And it has been really positive that Biden and Janet Yellen in the US have been very they've been on the offense on this, and they talk about this fight against corruption. They talk about the fight against kleptocracy. I think obviously as a contrast to the former U.S. administration, but also they tie it to democracy and the democracy building.
I want to emphasize this difference between the two U.S. administrations, between Trump and Joe Biden, because not only that Trump didn't do anything or a lot in this regard in fighting tax evasion, actually during his term, he allowed that US American companies can transfer their money, which were parked in tax havens, for a special discount into the US. So temporarily, this was, of course, a huge surge for the US economy. But in some way, he kind of legitimated that US companies were actually exploiting financial illicit flows. So yeah, and then on the other hand, you have Joe Biden, who is actively trying to crack down this issue. US dominance is really such a relevant factor here. I remember that Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, he demanded for years that there was this minimum taxation for globally implemented, and it was ignored. It wasn't a thing. And then Joe Biden is in office for like a month, and he says, all right, we're going to implement this. And a couple of months later, it's implemented. Boom. It's done.
There is, of course, as we can see here, a very diverse set of practices that fall into the category of illicit financial flows. We have the tax havens, we have financing terrorist organizations, and then we of course have these practices that are made available by enablers in different sectors. Then we have the political problems that arise when we're trying to tackle this. Problems of domestic policies in relation to foreign policies. We have the geopolitical and strategic competitive environment on the international level. And then we have all of these amazing initiatives and activists that are working to actually better this. And we have gotten a lot of insight into a very interesting project on this work, the UN high-level panel on financial accountability, integrity, and transparency, which I think is something that will be very interesting to follow going forward. And it's been great to gain your insights into that, Daniel, and to hear your work with that. I think to finish off, as we usually do, we go into our recommendations. So I hope that you guys have prepared something that is in line with our topic to get in today.
Yeah, before I get into my recommendation, I want to paint a little picture. I grew up in the West, or in the global North, as you like to call it. And so my main relation to drugs is just seeing people consume it, having fun with it. I can proudly say I never consumed cocaine, for example, but I've seen people using it, of course. And this is just one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is the global South, or South America, or Africa, where you see people, innocent people, dying every day because of gang violence, because of the war on drugs. And a kind of one connection to all those endeavors, one thing that connects those two coins is illicit financial flows. So I think, and we, the West, are not playing only a role through consuming those drugs, but also through not cracking down on such issues. I think a series that very well portrays this connection of the West fighting this war on drugs that doesn't really make sense, the West not acting on important fronts such as illicit financial flows, is the Narcos series by Netflix, which also has a sub-series called Narcos Mexico. And I just love it. It's really enjoyable. But on the other hand, you just see those interdependencies. It portrays the problem really well, in my opinion.
That's a very good background also for going into your recommendations. Highly appreciate that. And I wanted to hear, do you have just as good of an introduction to your recommendation, Fabio?
I don't think I can top that, to be honest. I think you stole me, Hermes. I love the series, to be honest. As a Latin American, as a Mexican, I really like Narcos. Of course, it has a Hollywood component, and things honestly didn't happen exactly like that. But I think it's a really good way to portray how corrupted society, well, not society, but the political elites are in Latin America, and how connected they are with the gangs and stuff. And yeah, it's really sad. Like I totally agree. I think it's one of the main problems of development in Latin America, the role of gang violence and cartels. But let's hope that we can crack on that as well. So US, please stop selling guns to Cartel de Sinaloa. That'd be great. My recommendation, it's a movie called Greed. It's a film that depicts this billionaire from the fashion industry, and it's just a movie of how the guy moves his assets, how he made his wealth, and the way that he tried to hide it in certain fiscal paradises and stuff. So it's a really good movie. I liked it a lot.
All right, Daniel, do you have a recommendation for us? Exit.
Yeah, no, I no, yeah. There's a Norwegian series, Exit, about financial tycoons that are breaking all kinds of laws. But I think I saw a documentary on a plane once, so it's probably not on Netflix, but it's basically called Panama Papers, and it's about how this international network of journalists worked together really strategically to expose like different political and economically invested persons in the extremely deep and the leaks that were basically shown there and how they're connected, and it shows how they were working really strategically to do that and to make those people accountable. And I think it was just an amazing story of how important the role of journalists is, and also how dangerous it is for a lot of the journalists and media people to work in this sector, because they are being basically threatened and kidnapped and murdered for trying to report on issues pertaining to political corruption, specifically economic corruption, and of course, as you know, in Mexico, on different issues related to drugs and crime around that. And so that's a really fascinating documentary. So I think it's just called Panama Papers. And then on the more trivial and side, you have The Laundromat, which is a film with Meryl Streep and I think Antonio Banderas or something. And I think it's more like a funny way of seeing how these things with a lot of sad serious consequences, but they have, like, of course, a more Hollywood way of showing that. So I would recommend those two.
Yeah. What about you, Chris? What's your recommendation for this week?
So mine is Butler to the World. It's a new book by Oliver Below, who I have recommended before. Not specifically this book, but his last book, Moneyland. I know you've read it also, Daniel. I think some of you guys also have read it. And fascinating look into all of the issues that we have been talking about today. I was very excited when I recommended the book the last time. I think it was in our second episode or so, and knowing that we were going to make this episode at a certain point. So this book it's kind of a follow up, but goes more into specifics on how the UK took up its position as one of the leading states that provide shelter for oligarchs, kleptocrats, gangsters. And yeah, highly recommended. I think people who enjoyed this podcast will enjoy all of these recommendations. So I think that's a good way to finish off. I think that we've been touching upon some really interesting and highly relevant, unfortunately, topics that need to be solved. So we need everyone who are interested in having a fair and just world where everyone has the same opportunity for development. And thank you for the podcast. Thank you, Daniel. And to our listeners who wants to join in the fight can awaken their inner warrior.
Oh yeah, there you go. Thank you very much, Daniel. It was great to listen from you. Really.
Yeah.
Until the next episode. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Yes.